August 20th, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. It was the third week of the U.S. Marine Corps' occupation of the island. The Americans had landed earlier that month, seizing a half-finished Japanese airfield the enemy had started to build near the north coast. They renamed it Henderson Field, and it became the first Allied foothold in the long Pacific campaign. The Marines' orders were simple in writing, but brutal in reality. Hold the airfield at all costs. It was the only piece of ground in the South Pacific from which Allied planes could threaten Japanese supply lines to New Guinea. The Japanese, losing Guadalcanal, was unacceptable. And on the night of August 20th, they were coming to take it back. The perimeter around Henderson Field stretched in a rough semicircle, backed by jungle and broken rivers. The eastern edge was the weakest point, a narrow sandbar where the Ilu River, often misnamed Alligator Creek by the Marines, spilled into the sea. The water was shallow, barely waist-high at low tide, but bordered by thick mangrove swamps that made visibility poor. That was where the enemy would come. The defense of that sector fell to First Lieutenant Jack Whitaker, 23 years old, commanding Company F, 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. Whitaker had joined the Marines before Pearl Harbor. Before the war, he'd been a farmhand in Kansas, a quiet, disciplined man who enlisted because he wanted to see the world. Now, after weeks of heat, malaria, and constant Japanese air raids, he looked 10 years older. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep, his uniform permanently stained with sweat and mud. His men, just over 160 Marines, were dug in along the western bank of Alligator Creek. They had machine guns, two 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, and a thin line of riflemen behind a row of sandbags and fell palm logs. Most of them had never fought a major battle before. Whitaker's second-in-command, Sergeant Frank Dawson, was an older Marine, 31, from Pennsylvania, a pre-war regular who had served in China. He was hard-edged and quiet, always chewing tobacco and checking his men's weapons twice before dark. His section handled the right flank near the beach, where the ground was flat and exposed. On the far left, near the jungle edge, Private Eddie Doc Sullivan, a former medical student from Chicago, was crouched beside a Browning M1917 machine gun. He'd joined the Corps 6 months earlier, assigned as a field medic, but pressed into the machine gun crew when his platoon lost 2 men to malaria. He carried both a first aid satchel and spare ammunition, a T-2000 hours. Whitaker made his last inspection. He moved quietly along the line, stopping at each position, checking that every man had full magazines, that the gun oil hadn't washed off in the humidity. He spoke softly to keep nerves steady. "Keep your eyes on the water," he told them. "They'll try to cross there when the tide's low. Wait until you can see them clear." He returned to the command post, a dugout reinforced with coconut logs, and checked the field telephone. Static crackled. Communications with battalion headquarters were intermittent. Beyond Henderson Field, the rest of the Marines were dug in under the same oppressive darkness. Across the river, in the jungle, Colonel Kaineo Ichiki and roughly 900 Japanese soldiers from the 28th Infantry Regiment prepared to attack. Ichiki had been ordered to land, march across the beach, and overrun the American perimeter in one swift assault. He believed the Marines were few in number and demoralized. His men had fought in China and believed no American force could withstand a Japanese night charge. That belief would cost them everything. Why midnight? Rain clouds drifted over the moon. The jungle was nearly black. The Marines waited, rifles resting on the parapet, eyes fixed on the creek. The only sounds were the distant surf and the slow drip of rain through palm leaves. Whitaker checked his watch. 1:10 hours. He leaned toward his radio man. "Tell Dawson to stay alert. They'll hit soon." A faint rustle came from across the creek. Then another Sullivan's voice whispered through the phone line. "Lieutenant, movement on the far side." Whitaker raised his binoculars. The far bank was barely visible, but he could make out shapes. Dark, moving in the water. "Steady," he said. "Hold fire." More movement. A glint of metal. A shout in Japanese. Then suddenly, a flare burst into the sky. The night turned white. Hundreds of figures were in the open, wading across the creek. rifles held high, bayonets fixed. Fire! The Marine guns erupted at once. Machine guns rattled in steady bursts. The 37mm cannons fired canister shells that tore through the charging ranks. The first wave of Japanese soldiers fell instantly. The second stumbled over their bodies and pressed forward. The sound was deafening, rifles cracking, brass cartridges clattering onto wet sand. Whitaker moved along the line, shouting orders. Keep it tight. Don't waste ammo. Sullivan's gun overheated. He switched barrels, the metal smoking in the rain. Dawson's section fired point-blank down the beach as men tried to flank the right side. The air smelled of cordite and sea salt. For nearly 20 minutes, the Japanese came on without stopping. Bodies piled in the surf. The creek water turned dark with mud and blood. The Marines held their ground. When the firing finally eased, Whitaker crouched behind a log, breathing hard. His ears rang from the explosions. He reloaded his rifle and looked toward the sandbar. It was littered with motionless forms. The tide was coming in again, washing over them. He said nothing. The first assault had failed, but in the darkness beyond the creek, the enemy was regrouping. The battle was far from over. The first Japanese assault had been broken, but not destroyed. Across Alligator Creek, the survivors of Colonel Ichiki's force regrouped under the cover of darkness. In the thick jungle canopy, officers shouted orders, rallying what remained of their companies for a second push. Their doctrine, forged from years of war in China, demanded relentless attack until the enemy collapsed. They believed the Americans were few, disorganized, and frightened. They believed wronged out on the western bank. Lieutenant Jack Whitaker crouched behind a log, checking his men's ammunition. The smell of gunpowder hung in the humid air. His machine gun crews were drenched in sweat, eyes red from smoke. Some men had run out of water. Others had lost their helmets in the chaos. Private Eddie Doc Sullivan wiped grime from his face and leaned against his weapon. His hands trembled from adrenaline. The overheated gun barrel beside him glowed, faintly orange. "They'll be back," he muttered. Whitaker nodded. He was already on the radio, with battalion headquarters, reporting the situation. Multiple enemy waves, heavy casualties among the attackers, all defensive positions intact. He ended the transmission with a single sentence. "We're holding." A pause of static came back, then a simple response. "Good. Reinforcements on standby. Keep them out of Henderson." That was the only plan. The airfield behind them, the lifeline of the entire campaign, could not fall to T-230. The jungle exploded again. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged forward, this time from multiple directions. Some charged straight across the sandbar. Others attempted to wade through the shallows farther inland. Their officers carried swords raised high, urging them forward with cries of "Banzai." The Marines met them with disciplined fire. Machine guns opened first, cutting wide arcs across the river. The 37mm cannons fired again, each shell bursting with hundreds of steel balls that tore through the charging ranks. The sound of automatic fire was continuous, deafening. Sergeant Frank Dawson, on the right flank, stood beside his gun crew, shouting corrections. "Left. 2 yards left," he yelled over the blast. His men shifted the gun, spraying the next wave as they emerged from the surf. A shell burst behind the Marine line, throwing sand into the air. Japanese mortar teams had opened fire from the far tree line. The rounds landed short, but close enough to rattle nerves. Whitaker grabbed the field phone. "Counter battery. 3 rounds on grid 25. Get those mortars quiet." Moments later, the Marines' 75mm pack howitzers at Henderson Field responded. The shells whistled overhead and crashed into the jungle across the river. The explosions sent palm trunks and bodies flying into the air. The battle had become a contest of endurance. The BY-315, the second wave, was shattered. The ground in front of the Marine line was carpeted with motionless figures. But small groups of Japanese soldiers had crawled close, within 20 yards, using the dead as cover. Some tried to drag wounded comrades back. Others launched desperate bayonet charges, shouting as they rushed forward. Whitaker ordered flares fired into the air. The white light revealed the scene in brutal detail. Hundreds of enemy bodies tangled in the creek, weapons scattered. the rising tide washing over them. Private Sullivan fired short bursts, conserving ammunition. "They're still moving out there," he said. Whitaker replied quietly, "Then keep shooting until they stop." At 4 o'clock, the last organized attack began. The Japanese charged again, fewer now but still determined. Some carried satchel charges. Others crawled with grenades in their hands. They never reached the line. The Marines cut them down before they were halfway across. When the firing ended, silence fell. Only the sound of the surf and the slow hiss of rain falling through the palms. The enemy had ceased moving. Whitaker moved along the defensive line, checking each position. "How many left?" he asked Dawson. Dawson spat tobacco into the mud. "We're good. 2 wounded, that's all. They're finished out there." The lieutenant looked across the creek through the dim light of dawn. The scene was almost unreal, a sandbar covered in bodies, weapons, and torn equipment. Smoke drifted from burned patches of grass where tracer rounds had ignited the undergrowth that he turned to his men. "Hold position. No one crosses until daylight." As the sky turned pale gray, the full scale of the battle became visible. The creek had become a grave. The Marines' rifles were hot to the touch, their gun barrels blackened. Dawson sat on an ammunition crate, rewrapping a bandage on his arm. Sullivan lit a cigarette, hands shaking. Around them, the men spoke little. Whitaker stood and watched the sun rise over the ridge. He had expected another assault. None came. Across the water, birds began to return to the mangroves. The tide rolled in, covering the sandbar inch by inch. The Japanese assault had failed completely. At 6 o'clock, orders came from battalion headquarters. "Prepare for counterattack. Sweep the far bank and confirm enemy destruction." Whitaker nodded and gathered his platoon leaders. "We move at first light," he said. "No one gets through that creek alive." He didn't know it yet, but the fight ahead, the mopping up operation through the coconut groves, would be worse than the night itself. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the palm trees and the steaming jungle canopy. Mist hung low over the river, and the tide had turned, drawing back the dark water that now carried away debris, rifles, helmets, fragments of bamboo packs, and motionless bodies drifting out toward the sea. The night battle was over. But it wasn't finished. Lieutenant Jack Whitaker stood beside the wreckage of his defensive line, watching the far bank through binoculars. He saw no movement, no return fire, no sound except the low hiss of the tide. It was eerie, an unnatural quiet after 6 hours of chaos. Behind him, Marines were reloading, cleaning weapons, and caring for their wounded. Private Eddie Doc Sullivan crouched over a man whose shoulder had been torn open by shrapnel. The wound wasn't deep, but the smell of blood mixed with mud made it hard to breathe. Sergeant Frank Dawson walked along the line, checking his gun crews. "Keep your heads down," he said. "Don't assume they're all dead." Whitaker lowered his binoculars and signaled his platoon leaders forward. The order for battalion had been clear: cross Alligator Creek, clear the east bank, and destroy any remaining Japanese resistance. That he gave his men 5 minutes. They ate what was left of their rations, cold canned beans and a swallow of water. Then fixed bayonets and prepared to move. T-715, 2 Marine Stuart light tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion rumbled up from Henderson Field. The ground shook beneath their treads. Each tank carried a 37mm gun and a coaxial .30 caliber machine gun. The same type used in Whitaker's perimeter. One of the tank commanders, a corporal from Oregon, shouted through the hatch. "We'll take the front. You keep our flanks clean." Whitaker nodded. "We'll move with you until the tree line. After that, it's on us." The tanks rolled forward, clanking across the muddy creek bed. Their tracks crushed palm fronds and helmets as they went. Whitaker's men followed, rifles up, boots sinking in his soft sand. The air was thick with smoke and decay. The smell of gunpowder still hung over the beach. As they crossed the creek, the scene came into full view. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay across the sandbar, many where they'd fallen during the night. Some still gripped rifles. Others had been caught mid-motion, bodies twisted where the canister shot had struck. The rising heat of the morning began to bring the stench of death. Private Sullivan looked away. "Jesus," he whispered. Whitaker didn't answer. He simply motioned forward. Once across the creek, the Marines fanned out into the coconut grove on the far side, the same grove the Japanese had used to stage their attack the night before. Inside, scattered survivors waited. Some were wounded, lying against tree trunks, still clutching weapons. Others tried to crawl away, leaving trails in the mud. A few fired single desperate shots. The Marines replied instantly, short bursts from Thompsons and bars cutting through the leaves. That it was not a battle anymore. It was execution by necessity. At 1 point, Dawson spotted a group of about 20 Japanese soldiers gathered in a shallow depression. They raised a white cloth, a surrender flag, but one of them opened fire as a Marine approached. The tanks responded with a blast from the 37mm gun, silencing them. Whitaker radioed headquarters. "We're across." Heavy casualties on their side. No organized resistance remaining. He turned to his men. "Keep sweeping. Don't take chances." By mid-morning, the area east of Alligator Creek was cleared. The Marines counted 15 prisoners, dazed, some wounded, all silent. They refused food and water, staring blankly at the bodies of their comrades. A capture document later identified their unit. The Achiki Detachment, elite troops from the 28th Infantry Regiment, sent ahead of the main Japanese force to retake Guadalcanal. Out of 900 who landed, fewer than 100 were still alive. Whitaker stood near the wreck of a Japanese field radio, reading over the shoulder of an interpreter. The final message sent to their command had been brief: enemy strong. Many dead. Situation impossible. He folded the note and handed it to the intelligence sergeant. "Get that to HQ." At noon, the tanks returned to the West Bank. The Marines followed in small groups, exhausted and silent. The sun beat down hard, and the flies had already begun to gather. Private Sullivan walked last, carrying his medic kit, his uniform soaked in sweat. He stopped once, looking back across the river, the sandbar glinting under the sun, littered with steel helmets and spent shells. Dawson joined him. "You'll smell this place for the rest of your life," he said quietly. Sullivan nodded. "Already do." They crossed back together. When Whitaker reported to battalion command that afternoon, Colonel Cresswell listened without comment. Then he said, "You did your job, Lieutenant. We just won the first land victory against Japan in the Pacific." Whitaker only nodded. "We held the line, sir. That's all." But later that evening, sitting alone near his foxhole, he looked toward the east, where the smoke still hung over the creek. He took out a small notebook and wrote a single line. "They came believing we would break. They were wrong." By the time the sun reached its highest point, the battle for Alligator Creek was over. The guns were silent, the tanks had withdrawn, and the smoke from the morning's shelling drifted lazily across the coconut grove. The men of the 1st Marine Regiment began the grim task that always followed victory: counting the dead, collecting weapons, and burying their own. Lieutenant Jack Whitaker sat on an ammunition crate near the western bank, his uniform stiff with dried sweat. His radio operator was writing casualty figures on a clipboard: 7 Marines killed, 20 wounded. Across the creek, more than 700 Japanese soldiers lay where they'd fallen. Whitaker watched the far bank through the heat haze. Nothing moved. No gunfire, no sound but the insects. For the first time in days, the airfield behind them was quiet. Sergeant Frank Dawson approached, wiping his face with a dirty rag. "Colonel says we're to start clearing the field by sunset. No one wants this mess sitting out overnight." Whitaker nodded slowly. "Get a detail together. I'll go with them." The burial detail crossed Alligator Creek again around 1600 hours. The scene on the sandbar was beyond anything the men had imagined. The night's chaos had frozen in daylight. Rifles were half buried in the sand, packs spilled open, letters and photos scattered in the mud. Many of the Japanese soldiers still clutched their weapons. Some had grenades gripped in their hands that never detonated. Private Eddie Doc Sullivan carried a shovel and his medical satchel. He had seen wounds before, bullet holes, burns, broken limbs, but not like this. The canister rounds had torn the enemy apart. He worked in silence, breathing through his mouth to keep out the smell. Dawson oversaw the work with steady eyes, giving quiet instructions. "Stack the rifles. Take the bayonets off first. Careful with the bodies. Check them before you move in. Some might be booby-trapped. They worked for hours. The Marines piled captured gear in neat rows. Rifles, swords, grenades, even a few light machine guns. Intelligence officers photographed everything. At one point, Sullivan stopped to examine a wounded Japanese soldier found among the dead. The man was barely conscious, his uniform torn to shreds. When Sullivan knelt to give him water, the soldier turned his head away. He said something in Japanese, low, guttural. The interpreter nearby translated softly. He said, "Leave me. I failed." The Marine medic froze for a moment, then stood up. The soldier died minutes later. By dusk, the cleanup was nearly finished. A long trench had been dug inland from the beach, not for the Marines, but for the enemy. Bulldozers from Henderson Field pushed earth over the bodies. A few Marines watched silently. No one cheered. No one spoke. Whitaker stood apart, leaning on his rifle. He had seen combat before in smaller skirmishes, but not on this scale. This was slaughter, precise, absolute. He didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion. Dawson joined him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "They came at us like they thought we'd just fall apart," he said quietly. "I don't think they believed we could stand our ground." Whitaker nodded. "They'll believe it now." He looked east toward the jungle. Somewhere beyond the trees, the rest of Ichiki's regiment, the main Japanese force, still hadn't arrived. He knew this victory was only a beginning. That night, back at Henderson Field, the Marines gathered for a hot meal, their first in 2 days. The mess area was lit by lanterns and a faint glow from the airfield searchlights. Planes were parked nearby, silent silhouettes under tarps. The men ate in silence, listening to the faint hum of generators and the distant rumble of surf. Sullivan picked at his food, appetite gone. Dawson sat beside him, boots still muddy from the creek. Whitaker joined them, dropping into the sand beside a fuel drum. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, "We stopped them here." "That matters." Dawson nodded. "Yeah, but they'll be back." "They will," Whitaker said, "and we'll be ready." Later, in the battalion command tent, reports came in. Patrols confirmed the destruction of the Ichiki detachment. Over 800 Japanese dead, 15 captured. Colonel Ichiki himself had reportedly committed suicide on the field after ordering his men to burn their regimental flag. When the figures were relayed to General Vandegrift at division headquarters, the general said only one thing: "Tell the men they've done what the world didn't think possible." They stood up to Japan and won. It was the first major U.S. ground victory of the Pacific War. Whitaker returned his foxhole near midnight. The jungle was quiet again, the sky clear, the stars visible above the palms. The smell of smoke lingered, a mix of diesel, gunpowder, and death. He opened a small notebook and wrote, "August 21st. Battle over. Field secure. Men exhausted. We won, but at a cost. There's no glory in this, only relief." He closed the book, set it aside, and leaned back against the sandbags. For a moment, the weight of the night lifted. He thought of home, flat Kansas fields, his father's barn, his mother's kitchen window open to summer air. Then he heard the low, distant growl of engines. Japanese bombers returning for another night raid. He reached for his helmet and muttered, "So much for quiet." Morning light broke over the airfield through a haze of smoke and low clouds. The previous night's Japanese air raid had struck the northern edge of the runway, killing 2 Marines and destroying a fuel truck. The smell of burnt aviation gas lingered in the humid air. Yet the men of the 1st Marine Division stood taller that morning. For the first time since landing on Guadalcanal, they had proof, solid, undeniable proof, that the Imperial Japanese Army could be stopped. Word of the victory at Alligator Creek spread quickly across the island. Patrols returning from the east brought back the same story. The enemy force had been annihilated, their commander dead, their equipment captured or destroyed. Marines working on defensive trenches paused to listen to the reports, exchanging silent looks that mixed disbelief with pride. Private Eddie Doc Sullivan walked along the airfield perimeter carrying his medical kit. He hadn't slept much. The images from the creek stayed with him, the faces, the smell, the noise. But as he passed groups of Marines gathered around breakfast tins, he could sense something new in the air. They were still afraid. But now they knew fear could be managed. Inside a sandbag command bunker near the center of Henderson Field, the division staff met at 0900 hours. Maps were pinned to the walls, covered with pencil markings. At the head of the table, Major General Alexander Vandegrift read the official report. Estimated Japanese casualties, 750 to 800 killed. American casualties, 7 killed, 20 wounded. Enemy force identified as elements of Ichiki detachment. He looked up at his officers. This changes things, he said. They're not invincible. The men needed this. Lieutenant Jack Whitaker sat quietly in the back of the room. One of several junior officers called in to brief the staff. He looked worn out, hollow-eyed from lack of rest, his hands still shaking from caffeine and adrenaline. When the general finished, Whitaker was asked to speak. "Sir," he began, voice steady. "They fought hard. No hesitation. But they came straight into the creek, shoulder to shoulder. They didn't adapt. Once our fire pinned them, they kept advancing until there was no one left." Someone asked about morale. Whitaker thought for a moment. "The men are tired, sir, but they believe now. That's the difference. They've seen what they can do." Vandegrift nodded. "Good. We'll need that belief." The meeting ended without ceremony. Everyone knew more battles were coming. Outside, the reality of daily life resumed. Pilots of the Cactus Air Force, the mixed Marine, Navy, and Army flyers stationed at Henderson, refueled their planes and prepared for Japanese bombing runs. Engineers patched holes in the runway with crushed coral. Mess tents served cold coffee and tinned meat. But beneath the routine, a quiet shift had taken place. Sullivan spent most of the morning treating minor injuries and infections. Between patients, he sat under a palm lean-to, scribbling in a small notebook he used for medical notes. He wrote, "They say it's a victory. Feels strange to call it that. We buried hundreds yesterday. Still smells like it out here. But I guess this is what winning looks like." That same morning, 1,000 miles away in Rabaul, Japanese officers gathered in a dimly lit operations room at 8th Area Army Headquarters. News from Guadalcanal had arrived via shortwave, an incomplete report from the remnants of Ichiki's unit. The message was brief, almost incoherent. Attack failed. Heavy losses. Enemy strong. Reinforcements requested. By the time the Japanese high command pieced together what had happened, the Ichiki detachment no longer existed. Colonel Ichiki, once celebrated for his service in China, had burned his regimental colors and committed suicide beside the sandbar where his men fell. His superiors in Tokyo refused to believe the scale of the defeat. Some insisted the Marines must have used tanks and artillery in overwhelming numbers. Others blamed Ichiki for acting prematurely without full support. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. The Imperial Japanese Army had underestimated the Americans. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines continued strengthening the perimeter. They dragged and captured Japanese weapons, cleaned them, and used some for spare parts. The tropical heat made everything harder. Men collapsed from exhaustion, malaria, or dysentery. Whitaker led his platoon through supply duty that afternoon, hauling ammunition boxes from the beach to the lines. He moved quietly, saying little. When Dawson walked beside him and asked if he was all right, Whitaker answered without looking up, "I'm fine. Just tired. It doesn't feel real yet." Dawson gave a small nod. "That's because it ain't over." He was right. Reports from aerial reconnaissance confirmed new Japanese convoys heading south from Truk toward the Solomons. Reinforcements were coming. The Marines' position, though victorious, remained precarious. That evening, after sunset, the airfield lights went out under blackout orders. The men sat in their foxholes, smoking in silence, listening to the drone of distant engines. Whitaker sat with Sullivan near the edge of the field. They passed a canteen back and forth. Sullivan said, "Do you think they'll try again?" Whitaker answered, "They have to. They can't afford to let us keep this airfield." They watched the horizon, where the faint flashes of naval gunfire flickered, Japanese destroyers shelling the coastline miles away. Sullivan took another sip. "Then we'll be right here when they do." Whitaker didn't reply. He stared out toward the dark sea, thinking of the hundreds who died across the creek. Men who had followed orders as he had, men who never expected the battle to end this way. He finally said quietly, "We'll hold." But I don't think it gets easier. Hours later, as the night deepened, Japanese bombers returned. Their engines droned low over the island, followed by the rising shriek of falling bombs. The ground shook. Tracers from Marine anti-aircraft guns streaked upward into the black sky. The battle for Guadalcanal had only just begun. 3 weeks had passed since the Battle of the Tenaru, or Alligator Creek, as the Marines called it. The victory had faded into memory, replaced by the grind of daily survival. The jungle pressed in from all sides. Rain came down in sheets every afternoon, turning the foxholes into pools of mud. Flies swarmed around the latrines. At night, the sound of engines offshore signaled Japanese destroyers shelling the perimeter. Every day brought air raids, hunger, and exhaustion. The Marines held their ground, but the island held them back. Lieutenant Jack Whitaker had grown thinner, his face hollow from lack of sleep and quinine sickness. He still commanded what was left of his company, 113 men now, reduced by malaria more than bullets. Every morning he walked the line, checking the machine guns, the field wires, the dugouts reinforced with logs. It was routine, but it kept the men steady. Private Eddie Doc Sullivan had become indispensable. He treated tropical ulcers, infected cuts, and fevers with the few supplies left. His medical tent smelled of iodine and rot. Every time a transport ship tried to bring more medicine, Japanese aircraft found and sank it. Sergeant Frank Dawson had taken charge of training new replacements, boys barely out of boot camp, fresh-faced, still calling him sir. He didn't correct them. He just taught them how to shoot straight, dig fast, and keep their heads low. The men rarely talked about the battle anymore, but it hung in everything: the silence, the fatigue, the way no one looked at the creek when they passed it on patrol that on September 3rd, a convoy of Japanese troops attempted to land east of the Marine lines. They came under heavy naval and air attack, but several hundred soldiers made it ashore. Skirmishes flared through the jungle. Every time the Marines thought the enemy had been beaten, more appeared from the trees. Night. Gunfire echoed through the palms, short bursts followed by silence. The Japanese called these raids yakdake, burning hills. The Marines called it jungle noise. One evening, while the men sat eating cold rations, Sullivan broke the quiet. "You ever think about the ones at the creek?" he asked quietly. Whitaker didn't answer immediately. He was cleaning his rifle, hands moving automatically. Then he said, "Every night." Sullivan nodded. "Me too. I thought winning would feel different." Whitaker looked up at him. It did, for about 5 minutes. Neither man spoke again that in late September. Word finally reached Guadalcanal headquarters. The Japanese had confirmed the destruction of the Ichiki detachment. Tokyo had declared the unit lost with honor. Back on the island, that phrase meant little. The Marines were running on half rations, water filtered through canvas bags, and morale stretched thin. General Vandegrift issued a simple order: hold Henderson Field. No matter what happens, the airfield must not fall. That sentence defined every man's life. On September 12th, the Japanese returned in force. Fresh troops, better equipped, determined to avenge Ichiki's defeat. The Battle of Edson's Ridge followed, another brutal night of close combat. Many of Whitaker's men fought there, including Dawson's squad. They held the line again, losing dozens but preventing a breakthrough. By dawn, the ridge was littered with bodies, another echo of the sandbar weeks earlier. Whitaker was there as the smoke cleared. He found Dawson sitting on a crate, boots splattered with mud and blood. Dawson said nothing at first, just stared at the ground. Then, "They keep coming. Doesn't matter how many we kill, they just keep coming." Whitaker replied quietly, "Then we keep holding." He meant it. But deep down, he wondered how long men could endure this. By October, the 1st Marine Division had been on Guadalcanal for over 2 months. Disease had thinned their ranks, ammunition was low, and the tropical rains had turned their positions into swamps. Still, The flag over Henderson Field remained. A correspondent from Time magazine landed on the island and wrote, "The Marines here live on spoiled food and courage. They have turned a muddy airstrip into the most important piece of ground in the Pacific." It was true. From Henderson Field, American aircraft struck Japanese convoys daily. The victory at Tenaru had not just stopped one assault. It had secured the first real Allied foothold in the Pacific War. But to the men who fought there, it was more personal. Late one evening, Whitaker walked alone to the edge of Alligator Creek. The tide was low, the sandbar quiet under the moonlight. The jungle had started to reclaim the battlefield. Grass and vines grew over what had once been trenches and craters. He stood there for a long time, listening to the surf. He could still see it, the flashes, the gunfire, the chaos of that night. He thought about the Japanese officer who had led his men into the creek, certain of victory, and about his own men, who had faced that charge and never given ground. He took a breath and said softly, almost to himself, "We held." That was all that mattered. Epilogue. Legacy of Tenaru. The Battle of the Tenaru was the first decisive American land victory in the Pacific. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and gave the Marines their first test of endurance in a campaign that would last 6 months. Out of 917 Japanese soldiers under Colonel Ichiki, only 128 survived. Most were captured or killed in the days that followed. For the Marines, it was a lesson written in blood that holding ground demanded more than courage. It required endurance, discipline, and the willingness to fight for every inch. When the campaign finally ended in February 1943, Lieutenant Jack Whitaker's company numbered 57 men. He never spoke publicly about the battle. In his service record, under engagements, he wrote only 2 words: Alligator Creek. Narrator VO. The sandbar at Alligator Creek still exists today. Visitors say the jungle is quiet there now. But beneath the soil lies the memory of that night, when 1,000 men met in darkness, and the course of the Pacific War began to change. History remembers battles in terms of victories and losses. The men who fought them remember silence and what it cost to keep it.